Politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you.
An unreformed private insurance monopoly in this country.
By the military industrial complex.
Why is that a good thing for America?
Government is the problem.
And you ain't in it.
There is no democracy.
Nor does the Congress have any control over this cartel.
All day long, beating you over the head in your media, telling you what to believe, what to think.
There is very grave danger.
Because less than 15% of you read newspapers. Because the only truth you know is what you get over the tube.
It's a business.
They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. They want obedient workers. Obedient workers.
Welcome to Crusade Against Bullshit. I'm your host, Top Reno. Of course, I'm currently not joined for this 10-part series by my co-host, Mr. R.C. Rizza. He will be back, I promise you. We're still good buddies, good libertarian buddies. This is just a 10-part series that I wanted to tackle on my own. I think we need to get this, the Great Deception, the conspiracy for a counter-revolution out there, and then start up the show and base really the several shows, dozens of shows after that, based on this one massive conspiracy that really draws in a lot of other small conspiracies. In the first show, of course, we're going to recap that today, which we talked about the beginning of the Founding Fathers and the first two-party system. That was really critical to figure that out, to figure out what the Federalists were about and what the Jeffersonian Republicans are about, which, of course, is nowadays, by modern political scientists, it's called the Democratic Republicans, but that's a whole bunch of, as we like to say in this show, bullshit. They just like to claim, whatever they can to be Democrats or Republicans, whatever. I don't really care. I don't buy it, and either do a lot of other political scientists. So, anyhow, we're going to get into parts of. We're going to kind of take a step back here. Now, we got all the way basically up to the era of good feeling with James Madison. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to tell you a little story. We're going to pull a Beastie Boys on you. Got a little story, got to tell. Two bad brothers, so well. That's the only parts I know, guys. Anyways, we have a little story. It's kind of what the history books wouldn't teach you. So we're going to teach that little story today, and that story is about what we really fought the revolution for. So we're going to jump back, now that we've just, kind of explained that you had the Federalists come in with the banker's agent, otherwise known as Alexander Hamilton, come in. And then, of course, we had the Jeffersonian Republicans come in, the people that were fighting for the people, the politicians that were fighting for the people, the party that was fighting for the people, which was the Jefferson Party, and they really were fighting against the elites, which were the Federalists at the time. And we explained a lot of those differences. We'll get into those later. But we're going to take a little step forward, okay? And we're going to talk about a debt-based monetary system, which is something you're going to hear a lot about in this show, which is basically what we currently have in our system. Now, what is a debt-based monetary system in the most basic terms? Well, if you look in your wallet, you have actual dollar bills in your wallet, okay? If you have American dollars in your wallet, look at each one of those and they say Federal Reserve note on them. That's right. They're a note that says you owe money. It's because that note has been borrowed. In order to produce that $5 bill, for example, you have in your wallet, that $20 bill you have in your wallet, somebody had to borrow money to make it. So it's based on debt, and that's where the debt-based monetary system comes from. So if we as a country, say we borrowed just $100 and we created $100 in cash, and all that money went to one person, and that person had to go out and spend that money, and he had all the money in the country, and it was $100, and he had to pay just 1% interest on it. We're just using easy math here. He would then if he wanted to pay back that debt for that $100 that he borrowed, he had to pay back $101. Well, you have to ask yourself, if you only have $100 to pay back, it's all you have in your hands, how can you pay back $101? Well, the only way you could do that is by giving them $100 plus $1 in gold, $100 plus $1 in some other trade goods. That's the way you had to do it. Or if you didn't have gold or trade goods, then you would have to borrow another dollar off them. So, hey, it's borrowed another $100. Now you can pay back the 101, but now you only have 99, and you now owe 101 again. So that's kind of how the debt-based monetary system works. So let's go ahead. You're going to hear more about that, but that's how it's worked in the very beginning. You're going to hear these terms get brought up by some of our founding fathers, and of course, in future shows by other, politicians. So the counter-revolution, basically that we're speaking of right here, the conspiracy for the counter-revolution is part 2 of 10, episode 2. Oh, by the way, if you want to follow us, we're actively talking about this and many other topics on our Twitter account, so that you can follow us at the Crusaders BS. Go ahead and follow us. We put up great memes that we make ourselves. Also, we talk about current topics. You can also email me if you want us to talk about a topic. You can email us at info@crusadeagainstbs.com. And we'll, me and RC will discuss that, and we'll bring up that topic. And if I missed anything important in these first 2 shows, don't hesitate to let me know, and I'll bring it up in the 3rd show. Anyhow, so let's get to this counter-revolution. So this counter-revolution had been fought since the 1790s, and it really continues to this day. The American people, of course, which is us, are the ones who are losing this revolution at this time. We're fighting back, but we're currently losing it because the banks and the government are taking over more and more control. And if you remember what we discussed about the counter-revolution, it's basically this counter-revolution to take back control of the last bastion of freedom in this world. I mean, Europe was controlled by the royal families, which are basically made up of a whole bunch of brothers, sisters, and cousins, and they ruled Europe. And then all of a sudden, people revolted, left, came to America, and formed their own, form of civilization here, based on freedoms away from, basically a form of monarchy and or monarchical socialism. If that's a great term, if that's a fine term to use. And they basically moved away from that and formed their own republic over here, going back to the old days of the Roman Republic, which was so vastly successful for so many hundreds of years. They went back to that. And in doing that, it upset a lot of people. And then we fought a war, and basically because of the will of the British people and cost of the war, Great Britain basically decided to bow out, make peace, let us go. But they didn't let us go. They thought of another way they were going to take us over, and that was the counter-revolution through the banking system, through controlling our government. And that's where we're going to get into it now. So, and really there are more people in this world that are more powerful than the founding fathers who wanted to make sure America stayed under that control. All right? These elitists who were made up of bankers and the royal families in Europe refused just to let America just be free. They didn't want us to let us be free. They wanted to continue to rule us. And there are some people and some conspiracists out there that say that Great Britain still rules America to this day. So they set forth their conspiracy. And now I'm going to take you back to before the Revolutionary War, where this conspiracy kind of took hold, where they're controlled, because they were controlling us, but they were wrapping their hands around that control even before the revolution. To properly understand everything, let's go back to, let's say, 1729 and Ben Franklin. In 1729, Ben Franklin wrote a pamphlet called A Modest Inquiry into the Nature and Necessity of Paper Currency. That pamphlet title just rolls off your tongue, doesn't it? So natural. This pamphlet explained the need for the colonies to print and regulate their own currency, and that the colonies were wealthy for it. He called the currency a colonial script, and it was successful. Here are a few quotes from that pamphlet, from Ben Franklin. That is simple. In the colonies, we issue our own paper money. It's called colonial script. We issue it in proper proportion to make goods and pass easily from producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating ourselves our own paper money, we control the purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay to nobody. Now, remember I told you about the debt-based monetary system. No interest to pay to anybody when you're making your own money. He also said there was an abundance in the colonies, and peace was reigning on every border. It was difficult and even impossible to find a happier and more prosperous nation on all the surface of the globe. Comfort was prevailing in every home. The people in general kept the highest morale standards, and education was widely spread. Ben Franklin. So everything was great. We were making our own money. The problem with the colonial script is that the English bankers were not making any money off the colonies. So, of course, in reaction, to this wealth. And they saw this wealth because this pamphlet went to England. Ben Franklin was an ambassador in England. He was telling them how well we're doing. They didn't really like to hear that. They said, that's great. And then they turned around and they basically were pressured by the bankers, and when I say they, I mean the king and the English Parliament, to pass laws that would prohibit colonies from printing their own currency and to use gold and silver provided by the privately owned English bankers. Who were these bankers? Enter the Rothschilds. Mayor Amstel Rothschild formed his first bank in 1743, and quickly it spread across Europe and eventually into the Americas by the Revolution. And he was the one, along with the Oppenheimers and other bankers, and of course the royal families, like I said, brothers and sisters and cousins and nephews, they all were in on this as they wanted to make money off the massive colonies. I mean, there's a lot of money obviously to be made. If you look 240 years later at America, a lot of money to be made. So, of course, in 1751, the Currency Act of 1751 was passed, and the bankers reigned control over the money in the colonies, and therefore the colonies, finally they got it. Now, basically they said, hey, you cannot pay for really anything that's public debt with your own currency. You can pay your private debt. Hey, you could pay your neighbor if you owe your neighbor money. But if you have to buy stuff off of England or pay debt or taxes to England, you have to pay that in our gold and silver. Therefore, you have to buy our currency and give us gold and silver, which, of course, the colonies didn't have a lot of that at the time. And they also, of course, now with that law, established English banks in the colonies so we could get that money. So there are now banks all over the colonies so we could trade in our gold, silver, and our valuables to get their paper currency. In 1764, they passed harsher laws, not allowing the colonies to issue any currency and putting control of the colonies firmly in the hands of the bankers. Now we couldn't produce any. All public debts to England had to be paid for in gold and silver. Without enough gold going around, widespread unemployment occurred, as Ben Franklin put it. You're going to see this time and time again, the bankers taking control of our money and therefore the people throughout history. We're going to revisit this with Andrew Jackson, okay? I promise you, we're going to talk about this very thing again in this very episode. So we fight them like a good virus, and as in getting rid of the first bank, getting rid of the second bank. We did, but they always keep coming back, these bankers. And it's going to be a fight that we're going to be fighting for a long time, and who knows how much longer it's going to go. But the history books teach you that Americans fought against the British over taxes without representation. The stamp tax, the tea tax. We had the Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party, where we threw all the tea out into the Boston Harbor. We did all of it. That was the reason. That's what when you read your history books, that's what it was all about. Well, why not include the part about the currency? I mean, which it seemed like it was more important. I mean, why not include the part about the, let me go back. Why not include that part? Well, when the government, therefore the elite who own the government, write the history books, they will leave out what they don't want future generations to know. And they don't want the future generations to know what was really going on with the Revolutionary War, because they don't want this popping up over and over again in every class every year saying, why did we let the bankers take us over then and fight them, and then they do it again with the Federal Reserve. So, of course, they leave that out. So, but let's see, what the real reason was for the Revolutionary War. Peter Cooper, an industrialist and statesman who ran for president in 1876 and was, basically a billionaire in America, and was born in 1791, so he lived quite a long time, but he did run for president and lose. Peter Cooper said that after Franklin gave explanations to the true cause of prosperity in the colonies, the Parliament exacted laws forbidding the use of money in the payment of taxes. This decision brought so many drawbacks and so much poverty to the people that it was the main cause of the revolution. The suppression of the colonial money was much more important for the general uprising than the Tea and Stamp Act. Not far enough back for you? I didn't go far enough back? Okay, well, how about let's go back to Ben Franklin again. Let's go, Franklin, who was, of course, if you don't already know, a pretty important founding father, and, of course, he was one of the architects of American independence, wrote, the colonies would gladly have borne a little tax on tea and other matters had it not been the poverty caused by the bad influence of the English bankers on the Parliament, which has caused the colonies' hatred of England and the Revolutionary War. So right there, you have Ben Franklin saying exactly what was the cause of the Revolutionary War, not the Tea Party. See, Ben Franklin, why don't they show that in the history books? Well, they don't want you talking about this stuff. Well, I'm talking about it, and hopefully I won't be poisoned or shot like Prince or Michael Jackson or John Lennon or anything like that, because anybody who tends to revolt against these elitist bankers somehow ends up dying mysteriously, and then, of course, nobody wants to say, oh, he just died in an elevator? Do an autopsy, but you know what? No big deal. Oh, he died in the medical chair. No autopsy. We'll just call it a day. All right. So let's. But if that opinion wasn't enough, let's get a few more opinions from other statesmen of that era. Let's start with Thomas Jefferson. I believe the banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Already, they have raised up a moneyed aristocracy that has set the government at defiance. The issuing power of money should be taken away from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. And I apologize. I have a problem saying I can say aristocrat, but aristocracy, it's a hard word for me to say. But anyway, Thomas Jefferson, anti-bank. We already knew that. But let's take a look at another. Let's look at James Madison, a much more level-headed Jeffersonian republic. Even said, history records that the money changers have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible to maintain their control over government by controlling the money and its issuance. And then finally, we're going to go over to a Federalist, because I really don't believe that John Adams was a bad guy. I just think he was a good guy in a bad party. Banks have done more injury to the religion, morality, tranquility, prosperity, and even wealth of the nation than they can have ever done or will do good. So basically, anti-bank as well. It is important to note that England and the Rothschild Oppenheimer bankers owned and operated the colonies and refused to let them go. And while they gave up the fight during the war, they have never given up their fight for control of the American people. We will be going back to these bankers time and time again during this podcast, as they are the elites who ran the country. Now, at some point, we're all going to have to wake up to who is truly guiding this country. For those who think we elect the president, we don't. The bankers choose the candidates for us, and we choose from those, normally two. Voting for the Libertarian candidate or other parties' nominees is the only way to break the banker cycles of control. However, I digress on that, and for what this podcast is about. So we'll talk more about the elections, obviously, in a later deal. So let's go ahead and get back where we left off last show. We left off last show at the era of good feelings and James Madison. I was going to spend a little bit of time on judicial review, but basically Marbury versus Madison. But that basically was the court case during the Thomas Jefferson era, where judicial review came into effect, and that's kind of where it all started with the Supreme Court being able to look at a law and say it's illegal or it's legal. It started with Marbury versus Madison. Madison obviously won that one in Jefferson, but in the end it proved strong for the judicial branch of our government. And then, of course, I did really forget to bring up the Alien and Sedition Act that John Adams put into play. But that's one of those things. And I only want to bring this up momentarily because we're seeing them now. You see, the Alien Act, I'm not really as critical. That was more a limitation, on immigration, making people wait longer, live longer in America before they can become citizens and vote, so forth and so on. Not a good law, but nonetheless not as important as the Sedition Act, which basically says you can't say negative things about the President of the United States or the Congress. You can say it about the Vice President, who was Jefferson at the time, but if you say anything about the Congress or the President, you can go to jail. And actually, they did send a congressman to jail, and they sent many reporters to jail and newspaper editors to jail because of what they wrote. But the crazy thing about the Sedition Act is liberals are pretty much doing it again. And so for that to be a Federalist law, that ties them right into liberals, because if you say something negative about somebody, you get hushed. You get shut down. Trump can't go do a private speech without liberals yelling over him in one of his, victory speeches or just one of his campaign speeches. So his freedom of speech is abridged. Well, this abridged freedom of speech as well, and that's why Thomas Jefferson got rid of it. So the Sedition Acts really kind of remind me of what's going on today, and people just need to be a little less sensitive. So we leave the era of good feeling. Madison and Monroe, the last of the founding fathers, goes, and then we enter the election of 1824, which is where Andrew Jackson enters the game. And, in 1824, he entered the game and faced off against John Quincy Adams, who was previously a Federalist, but since the Federalist Party was now defunct, he became a Jeffersonian Republican. So he was a sheep in wolf's clothing, basically. And he came, at least as far as the Jeffersonians were concerned. So he came in the election, and he went up against Andrew Jackson. And in the end, Andrew Jackson took the popular vote. But between him, Clay, and John Quincy Adams, and I think there was a couple other people running for president, nobody got the majority of electoral votes. So this took this back to the Congress to vote for it. And at this point, Henry Clay, who was the Speaker of the House of Congress, basically made a side deal with John Quincy Adams, where John Quincy Adams said, I'll make you my Secretary of State if you vote me in as president and get me passed as president, which that happened, and it enraged Andrew Jackson. Now, why did Henry Clay want the Secretary of State? Well, basically, previous to him, almost every single president except for John Adams was a Secretary of State before he became president. I mean, Monroe was Madison's Secretary of State. Madison was Jefferson's. Jefferson was Washington's. So, before this, if you were the Secretary of State, you had a good chance to become a president. So he became the president, John Quincy Adams. Henry Clay became the Secretary of State. Enraged, like I said, Andrew Jackson. And he vowed to fight against this in 1828 and win the 1828 election. Now, enter Martin Van Buren for the 1828 election. And Martin Van Buren, I think, will go down in my history as one of the more horrible people because he's the one who formed the Democratic Party. And he didn't do it for the reasons you'd like him to do it for. He did it because he saw the power in parties. He saw that if you put together a party that you could campaign, raise money, make money, and therefore win elections, not by, necessarily just getting the information out to the people, but by twisting the people's minds with all these campaign slogans, which of course every party's now jumped on this bandwagon attack. But it really started with Martin Van Buren, who saw the profitability and also saw, of course, what was going on around that country at the time and knew that he needed to get a guy in who was more supportive of their needs. Now, they split off the Jeffersonian Republicans and ran against the Jeffersonian Republicans. So that's why people think, well, the Jeffersonian Republicans were in fact Democrats. But we'll take on that throughout the show and through the next couple of shows as well. Basically, he formed the Democratic Party and was all lined up and ready to get going with Andrew Jackson, 1828. Now, an interesting side note: one of the very first conspiracies in this country's history, that we talk about are the Freemasons. And there was a guy by the name of William Morgan who was going to write a book about the secrets of the Freemasons. And shortly after he announced that, he was arrested on bogus charges and he basically vanished. And most said that he was killed because he never was seen again after 1826. Now, why would this impact the 1828 election? Well, Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson were Freemasons. So here you have two Freemasons, two elitists, at least from the Freemason faction, come into play here. Without a doubt, Martin Van Buren was an elitist, but not necessarily Andrew Jackson. But they're both Freemasons, and they come into power. And this guy, William Morgan, who actually, I believe, joined the anti-Masonic party. Actually, you got to think, why was there an anti-Masonic party, especially after George Washington was one? Well, clearly they were doing things that weren't, jiving well with the people. So they formed that party. But anyways, he disappeared and was gone. So Andrew Jackson wins the 1828 election. Let's just move on. He wins in a landslide. The Democratic Party is formed. Martin Van Buren is thrilled. John C. Calhoun becomes the vice president. You'll have some stories later on. Now, everybody has their view on Andrew Jackson. Okay, he was the hero who fought in the War of 1812, won the Battle of New Orleans, and basically the War of 1812, even though it was technically over when he fought it. He is known for protecting the common man, and that he did do. Now, he was also known for the spoils system, which again was a ramification of Martin Van Buren, in my belief, affected him, saying, listen, you got in, you got to give all these jobs to the people who got us in, because now we took all these donations, now we have to pay up. And that's why I'm angry about the way the Democrats started this campaign. And by the way, there were 800,000 more voters in the 1828 election than there were in the 1824 election, which is about 2/3 more voters came in. And there's like a 200% increase 2/3 of the voters in that election were new voters. I think it tallied about 1.2, 1.3 million. So going back to Jackson, more things about him. Like I said, he protected the common man. He dearly loved his wife, but there was a dark side to him. I mean, first of all, he killed many people in duels, which is a little odd. But he would drop at a no moment's notice and fight a duel if he had to, which was taught to him by his mom. He was also, he killed a lot of Indians, both as a general and as a president, and responsible for the Trail of Tears. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But who was he? First of all, he served as a courier during the Revolutionary War, and he was taken as a prisoner of war and even wounded by a British officer, not necessarily during battle, but just for being a courier. And then he became a congressman and a senator for Tennessee. And when he was in the Senate, he hated the Jay Treaty so much, and this is a good factual point here to point out to you, because he really hated the Jay Treaty so much, just like the rest of the Republicans, that he voted against a resolution to honor George Washington. Now, the resolution passed, but he voted against it, and when asked why he voted against it, it was because he said he voted for the Jay Treaty. Now, Jackson did also oppose a centralized government and preferred a strict interpretations of the Constitution. And he was really focused on pulling power from the federal government and giving it to the states. In fact, he vetoed, he had a record number of vetoes, Andrew Jackson, record number of vetoes, 12 vetoes, including he vetoed I think a bridge and road project in Kentucky, because he basically stated that he didn't believe that the government was responsible for that. In fact, in this veto message, when vetoing that bill, he said, "It was not for territory or for state power that our revolutionary fathers took up arms. It was for individual liberty and the right for self-government." Now, Jackson's republicanism tried to bond the country. He really did, through patriotism and nationalism, which wasn't always a good thing, but maybe at this time it was just fine. Rather than ethnic solidarity or any kind of form of socialism that we see today. The American people are not known to him as masses or broken down into classes, but as individuals with equal rights. That's really how he saw them, and it's really critical to see how he saw the people as individuals with equal rights. So now let's go in, now that we understand kind of who Jackson is, let's talk about his vice president, John C. Calhoun, because this is where his problems began. He was his vice president. He was also, of course, from the great state of South Carolina. I believe he's a senator from South Carolina as well. So, of course, he joins him, and he was also, of course, John C. Calhoun was also a VP, by the way, for Quincy Adams. So he was a VP for 2 presidents in a row. But then enters, what really upset John C. Calhoun was the tariffs of 1828, and more so the tariff of 1832. Now, why was our country assigning tariffs to people? Well, they were assigning tariffs because basically the British were bringing in all these goods, these textiles, and cheaply made factory materials that were basically overrun our colonies, and they were made cheaper than we can make them here. And therefore, we weren't making any money in the North with our factories, and we were trying to, to be more industrial. So they put a tariff on in 1728 and expanded that tariff in 1732 to put a tax on all incoming goods. Now, what did that do? Well, that stopped people in the North from buying, say, British textiles, but it also made all the textiles that the South needed, because the South didn't make their own stuff. So they had to buy it. They either had to buy it from the North at the North's prices, or they had to buy it at the English prices. Well, those prices all went up, and it caused some extreme problems for the South. This is where John C. Calhoun enters in, and he basically says that the state of South Carolina is going to nullify this law, this 1832 tariff, and they're not going to respect it, they're not going to pay it, and he eventually leaves the vice presidency over this. And this is the first time where I think Andrew Jackson kind of shows a color or side that he didn't want to show, and that's because he goes out and he says basically, hey, if you're not going to abide by this law, you can't nullify it. States don't have the right to do that. I'm going to bring the federal army down upon you and make you pay that tariff. And so that's an example of, even though he supports state governments, the state was acting, basically in accordance with their their rights according to the 10th Amendment, and Andrew Jackson threatens the military. Eventually they have some meetings and they work it out, and they work out a compromise on the tariff. But in the end, Jackson did overrule state powers on one of the chances where he had to do it. And that wasn't the greatest thing in the world. Okay, so now we're going to take a step back. We kind of skipped over the Indians. Now this is another problem. Now, again, the Democrats of today would never have allowed the genocide of any party or of any person, any group of people. But back then, the first Democrat had no problem mass murdering Indians whenever they had a chance, particularly when he was a general and then when he was a president. And when he was a president, he signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which basically he wanted to chuck out a whole bunch of Indians from Alabama and Georgia. Now, why was he doing this? Well, he was doing this primarily because he wanted to free up those lands in that country and sell them to people in America so he can populate it. Also, Martin Van Buren was involved with this because Martin Van Buren, owed some debts for the election and wanted to collect on those debts and pay some of those people back for their hard-earned money that they gave the campaign. And so there's a little bit of cronyism here because not only did Jackson buy some of those lands, but a lot of the people who support the Democratic Party as well did. Now, John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, actually ruled that this act was unconstitutional based on the treaties we had with Indians. And this is again where he steps out of his Republican shoes, Andrew Jackson, and he said, quote unquote, Judge Marshall has delivered his opinion, now let him enforce it. And he went ahead and directly, went against the Supreme Court and removed the Indians promptly on the Trail of Tears. So again, going against not only the third branch of the government, but also in really the powers he has as an executive branch, expanding his powers. Now, one of the better things he did was in 1832, he killed the second Bank of the United States, which that election was based on the bank. I mean, the bank was raising interest rates, stopping loans, foreclosing. They were doing everything they could to hurt the American people into not voting for Andrew Jackson. They were blaming it all on Jackson. Well, Jackson's response to this was he did not relent. He continued to say he was not going to sign the new charter for the bank if he got elected. And after the bank did these dirty tricks to the people, Jackson promptly pulled all the money out of the second U.S. bank and put them in the state banks, and that right there basically ended the bank. And when their charter ran out in 1838, they were history. Upon vetoing this charter, he had a great quote where he said in a speech, "Equality of talents, of education, or of wealth cannot be produced by human institutions. In the full enjoyment of the gifts of heaven and the fruits of superior industry, economy, and virtue, every man is equally entitled to protection by law. But when laws undertake to add to these natural and just advantages artificial distinctions, to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, the farmers, the mechanics, and the laborers, who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, have the right to complain of an injustice for their government." Wonderful saying for a man who basically was saying, you're not going to take advantage of the middle class by destroying them and taking all the money you rich elitists. In 1834, Jackson also said if the people only understood the rank and justice of the money and banking system, there would be a revolution by morning. Now, of course, he was anti-big business and northern industry, as we all have already known, but he was into expansion in the West, and he was also for small governments. So, of course, he supported immigration. Another great thing he did is he was only president to pay off the national debt, and he did it on January 8th, 1835, because he believed we should live within our means. So Andrew Jackson, what was he? Was Andrew Jackson this great Democrat, or was he a Republican? You see, this is what I'm trying to say about in the first show, is that we don't know yet. These parties are constantly evolving. And we now have the true Democratic Party, but they're pro-slavery. Clearly, Andrew Jackson's pro-slavery. That's not even a doubt. They were for a smaller government, technically. They were for, tariffs, which is pretty normal for the Democratic Party. I mean, they were for, they were for a lot of things Democratic and a lot of things technically that are Republican now. And everyone's just so easy just to brush off some of these thoughts. But you can't. You can't sit here and say, well, if the original Democratic Party was for small government, what happened? What's happened over the past, 160 years or so? What's happened that this party developed into a much different party? We're going to see that because, frankly, I don't think we've seen a true Democratic Party yet. Because right now they have the White House, they comfortably have members in the House and Senate. They have, slavery in the South still runs strong. So things are going well for the Democrats right now. They're trying to keep the government small while expanding west, but they upset some people. Really quickly, let me make this clear about the Democrats at that time. Democrats stood for the sovereignty of the people. They did, as expressed in popular demonstrations, constitutional conventions, and the majority rule of general principle of governing. But then you enter into this party, the Whigs. So they stood for that, and because of that, because of these policies by Jackson, another splinter party formed from the Jeffersonian Republicans, which effectively ended the Jeffersonian Republicans. So the Jeffersonian Republicans break into Whigs and Democrats. Now, the Whigs were there primarily to fight Andrew Jackson. I mean, they were against him all the way, favoring a strong Congress and a weak executive branch, with the Whig Party. The party felt that he was abusing his power and becoming a monarch instead of a president. The founders, such as Henry Clay and John Quincy, named the party after the group of Englishmen which had opposed the monarchs during the Revolutionary War. So they named the Whig Party after the group who actually opposed the monarchs. So if you're really looking at what's going on here, okay, they're naming a new party, Clay and Adams, after this group of people who fought the monarchy. So they feel like they're fighting another monarchy, as though Andrew Jackson has become King Jackson, which he really kind of did. He really did kind of rule with an iron fist. Clay and Quincy were former Republicans and shared the Federalist idea of modernization and were in favor of the North. The Whig Party often nominated war heroes and their party from their party for the presidential elections. Now, the Whigs basically, in the end, had roughly about 4 presidents. They had Harrison, Taylor, Tyler, and Wilmer Fillmore. After that, of course, the Whigs ended up, going downhill and vanishing into the Republican Party of today, the GOP. But we'll get into that next show. But it is, important to know that, it appealed, the Whig Party, which fought against Andrew Jackson, appealed to entrepreneurs and planters, but had little appeal to farmers and unskilled workers. It included many active Protestants who voiced moralistic opposition to the Jacksonian Indian removal policy. So, I mean, if you kind of start seeing the development, here's where you have the second two-party system come into play for full tilt, where you have the Whigs who have definitely set themselves aside, that they really want to see the Congress. Remember, the Congress is the people, stronger than the actual executive branch, and they didn't want to see him abuse his power and become a monarch and do a lot of the things that really were king-based that Andrew Jackson did. So they formed this party. Now, again, it's fair to say they might have formed this party, but they formed a party using Federalists, like that of John Quincy Adams, who maybe by now had softened his tone on being a Federalist, but he was still nonetheless a Federalist. So as we get into the next show, we're going to take on, we're going to watch as the Democrats and Whigs go into battle into the elections into the 1850s. And when we get into that, we're going to really get into the Republican Party, because in effect, once John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay go away, the Republicans become the party. And the reason is because the Whigs, even though they were anti-slavery, they refused to act on it, and that was their biggest fault, and why their party was destroyed is because they refused to act on this anti-slavery fever that was going on throughout the North, and the Republican Party was formed because of it. So next show, in episode 3, we will get into that party, and we will get into the now standard Democrat versus Republican parties, and we're going to see how those parties continue to evolve. Because again, we're still not clear. Both these parties are still very libertarian. Both these parties are still very confusing. Both these parties do not match up. The Whig Party and or the Democratic Party do not match up to the current Republican Party or the current Democratic Party. So we're going to have to watch as this conspiracy develops. Because as you see, Andrew Jackson came in as a man for the common man, but and did things to battle the monarchy powers, but didn't do a very good job, didn't eliminate Martin Van